Hey everybody, so this is Chaney here in the third and final installment in the three-part series of Pleiadian Perspectives on human evolution. And we'll be talking about Maldek, which is the current asteroid belt. It used to be a planet. It resides in between Mars and Jupiter. And going right into it, there's many soul groups that incarnated on Maldek, and the first one I'm going to talk about is the Venetian Mars group of souls that incarnated from Venus to Mars and are now on Maldek. So they incarnated. Other groups include Andromedan Galaxy, souls from there, souls that came up through the densities of first and second, so new souls in the third dimension. Quick overview: first dimension is the mind dimension, where we have the elements earth, air, fire, and water, and no microbial life. Second dimension is biological, amoebas and bacteria, microbial life, all the way through the spectrum of animals, plants. And those entities have a mind and a body. So when we get to the third dimension, we have a mind, body, and soul. It's the soul. It can just be kind of regarded as a higher frequency that inhabits the mind and the body. Brief overview. Anyway, we have a group of the new souls on Maldek. We have another group of Orion souls that came from the constellation of Orion. Not sure what planet or where. And then we also have a group from another galaxy, which we'll be calling the Black Hole group for now. Or actually, they're from the Sogin constellation. So you guys can research Sogin, but this group of souls, apparently their galaxy collided with another galaxy, and it wasn't some catastrophe. It was just the natural blending of galaxies. It's what they do. It's a beautiful thing, and they just were interrupted in their evolution, so they came to Maldek, and we'll be regarding them as the Black Hole or Sogin group. So without further ado, let's get into it. The supreme being that was in charge of Maldek, we talked about in the first video how the cosmic hierarchy, there's many higher intelligence beings who are in charge of the lower dimensional or lower density beings such as ourselves, who kind of transmit light energy and information to us and to other species, animals, plants, whatever, and they're just kind of the mediaries between the very advanced intelligence of the sun. So all of those beings that were taking care of third dimensional beings on Maldek were under the supervision and management of the supreme being of Maldek, which Amorquanians terms as Lucifer. Before you get off the deep end with the meaning behind that, I'll be talking about that later. But this Lucifer supreme being that we'll be identifying as is in charge of the planet, and he brings in these souls, or he takes care of these souls as directed from the higher intelligence that we can only fathom as God, or a source intelligence. So Lucifer is taking care of these souls, and so in the evolution of these souls, Mars and Andromedan souls kind of incarnate together in the group. So across the planet on Maldek, we have it's a very large planet, and we have many different soul groups incarnating in different areas, so they have their own time to grow and to learn their own lessons before they start to exchange information and growth with others. So it was very much like on this planet, where we have different, very different, genetics popping up in different climates and different areas of the planet, and those are soul groups. So moving on, the Mars and Andromedan group were the first to incarnate together because they had very similar evolutionary lessons to learn. So without them even knowing, they're from different galaxies, they were just like, we'll just do this, Mars and Andromedan. And after a period of time, once they started getting their civilization established, they eventually began to get curious, and they wanted to travel. So they traveled to another location and eventually found the New Soul group. So we'll just call it New NS. The New Soul group was the first preliminary initial third-dimensional beings. It's their first lifetime as three-dimensional beings, so with a mind, body, and spirit. So they met the New Souls, and then they started to blend and learn from each other's culture, and they were a bit different. They looked very similar as far as skin tone and hair color and eye color and whatnot, but they had a little bit different emphasis. The Mars and Andromedan people were a little bit more mechanically inclined and more involved with motor skills, rather than the New Soul group was a little less primitive, but they were very copacetic, and they both had a good relationship. So and also another thing is that in the center of the Earth, in the center of the Maldek planet, there was beings also that were put there in order to facilitate this energy of masculine and feminine balance. So it's like Amora Kuan Yin describes it as like a tantric blending of the masculine and feminine, and their sole duty inside the planet and living there was to balance that energy. So throughout the story, we're not going to see much of warring and fighting over dominance. But anyway, the New Soul group blends with Mars and Andromedan group. So after a period of thousands of years, they trade, and they further their cultures together. And then let me just make sure it's on. Okay. So after a bit, we get to the Orion colony. So the Orion colony, or OC, is a little bit farther away than both the Andromedans, Martian, and New Soul group. And the New Soul group, the new colonies between them travel a further distance to explore a larger portion of the planet, and they come across the Orion group and Orion colony, where the Orion souls incarnated. They look very different. They have dark skin and they have white hair, and they're a little bit startled by each other at first, but with a little bit of compassion and hospitality, they began to learn from each other. And they were a little bit also different in cultural background and inclination. The Orion group was doing fine for themselves, yet they were still very emotionally sensitive. So they were very hospitable and sacred kind of beings, and they kind of threw off the Andromedan and Martian souls in the way that they didn't expect them to be so kind, and the way they touched them and all that, like it kind of uneased them a little bit because they weren't used to that. This group, Mars and Andromedan, were very analytical and logical, and the Orion group was more heart-centered and feeling kind of intelligence, and none are better than the other. But anyway, they continue to grow together and establish trade and cultural and also breeding. So they expand the gene pool and all that. Everything's great. There's no warring, no fighting. And then yet another, thousands, hundreds of years go by, and they want to explore further the planet, this gigantic planet. So they eventually run into the black hole group, or the Sogan group, and they are extremely different looking. They are very tall and blue skin and very slender, and they had a very small community. And when they found these people, the Sogans were very reluctant to them because they weren't into travel, and they weren't very they were just very complacent with where they were, and they weren't curious to go explore new places and find new ways of technology and trade and whatnot. So they were very hospitable to the travelers of the other colonies that discovered them. But there was a major difference in psychological and emotional inclinations, so they didn't exactly jive or resonate on a wavelength that was really going to help them grow together. So they really, when it came time for the traveler group from the other colonies to go home, the Sogans didn't want to leave their place, and the travelers didn't want to leave anybody at the Sogans' place, so they kind of split ways, and they didn't really talk to the Sogans over the course of a few hundred years, because they're such a long distance also from their colonies and their trade routes and whatever. So over that course of a few hundred years, there was new discoveries and inventions from the three main colonies, and so we see that really helping the civilization grow. And after a course of a 1,000 years or so, a couple thousand years, there's a soul group that gets incarnated into the species on Maldek, the Maldekians, which is the culmination of all those, and they're the Pleiadian children, and they're the souls from Pleiades, and they rename and kind of reorient the culture a little bit, so it's a little bit more spiritual. And this entailed and ensued with more wisdom, more less survival, instinctual kind of thinking. So it was more about peace, harmony, acceptance, appreciation, love, all that stuff. And the spiritualization of Maldek ensued. So everybody became more in tune with themselves and others. And during this period, there was, of course, there's still technology. There's, I think, she describes the highest form of technology they have is like steam power, mechanics, so it's very basic, but still they understand like combustion and a little bit about three-dimensional physics and gravity and whatnot. After this spiritualization happens, they go back to the Sogan colony, and the colony is actually destroyed by like natural disasters, floods and whatnot. So there's very few homes and people left, and there are some that decide to stay with the Sogan group, but actually when the colonists moved back to their place after the second time visiting the Sogans, they still didn't want to go with them, maybe because of their own hang-ups, but they were a little bit comfortable and stuck in their ways, so to speak. And during this next period, there was the karmic patterns of each soul group were reintroduced. So we see a steady incline and decline in each period, kind of throughout this whole series. And the karmic patterns that are reintroduced help evolve the souls, but it's a challenge for them. And there's feeling emotional discontent, anger, jealousy, rage, sadness, guilt, shame, all those emotional things actually reappear in the civilization, and there's some like psychological and emotional distortion among the civilization for a number of decades and centuries, and they kind of try and figure it out, but it eventually gets to such a point where the imprisonment of violent crimes starts happening. So they start to imprison people that are violent towards each other, and when that still is not getting any better over the course of years, decades, whatever, they eventually instill like capital punishment. So each colony now uses the death penalty for the people who violently are like imposing upon others' free will and trying to dominate each other. And from this point, if they actually none of the colonies really get much better. It's just or in technology or anything, they just begin to decline, and the supreme being that was, of course, this whole timeline was a span of tens of thousands of years. So although they didn't get as much technologically advanced as we are today, they still got a lot of evolutionary progress going on. And to continue on in the story, the civilizations kind of made a decline, even though they were still living and growing and doing what they needed to do to survive. They slowly made a decline in like psychological health and like violent crimes, not on the mass scale of war, but just like people really stealing and killing each other and whatnot because of emotions. And also there was a lot of dementia and split personality disorder and psychological distortions, where it led to just not clear thinking and a survival state. So this reflected on the higher dimensions in a way that they started to doubt the natural flow and ebb and flow of evolution. So there's a distrust in divinity, not only in the lower realms of three-dimensional humanoids, but also in the higher realms of angels, archangels, supreme being, whatever. So this began with this entailed as like the supreme being Lucifer as distrusting his own divinity and the own divinity of the supreme source where he gets his information. So Lucifer as a supreme being, thinks that there's he constructs this idea and this thought form that as being in charge of this planet and the species, that he has to protect them from the supreme source that is above him, because what the supreme source he thinks is trying to do is keep everybody asleep and won't let them won't help them or let them spiritually evolve. So the supreme being basically points the finger and does not take responsibility for what's happening, and he just loses trust, and he thinks that the whole intelligence of the cosmos are against him. So when it came time for a certain alignment in the galaxy and in the galactic center, there's a photon belt that kind of or a high frequency light belt that aligns certain stars. And I think the stars that she mentioned were like Alcyone and Sirius and a bunch of other stars that aligned in this photon belt and create a higher frequency, that the planet and the solar system would be moving in through this narrow band where it would really just like speed and make the evolutionary process more rapid. So during this period that was coming up that Lucifer knew about, Lucifer being distrusting his source intelligence and the higher intelligence that he gets his information from, completely goes against that intelligence and thinks that he needs to protect the people of Maldek and the planet from the intelligence, because he distrusts it. And turning against it, he starts to manage and direct the lower dimensional beings to go along with his own plot. And eventually, when the planet gets to the photon belt, Lucifer uses all of his energy as the supreme being over the planet to block the rays of the sun, because the sun encodings are what's gonna enhance the vibration of the planet. And he puts this, all of his power and energy to block the planet from the encodings of the sun, and he directs all the other beings, archangels and lower higher dimensional beings, whatever, and they and when they do this, it eventually becomes it throws the planet out of orbit. So, and it made the planet immediately go into a self-destruct kind of state, because the electromagnetic frequency wasn't locked in with the sun, and because of this blocking of the solar encodings of the sun, the planet and the plate tectonics and everything, it just naturally combusted, and it completely destroyed the planet and everything on it. And the souls, of course, were transported and transported to actually Earth, where the souls could begin a new cycle. And I think the story is just as a great analogy or lesson, that when we don't trust our own divinity and the course of our lives and beingness and in all its forms, then we become egotistical and controlling, and we block out that higher intelligence and that natural cosmic flow of evolution, and which should be, really pleasant and also wondrous and expansive, and should be really astonishing, and should really humble you to learn new things. And that's the thing about my own philosophy. I'm embedding this into the video right now, is that you really gotta feel stupid a lot of the time to learn something new. You have to destroy those constructs, that ego identity, in order to take something new in. So if everything else, hopefully this was enjoyable, and you guys could take some things away from it. And if you guys want to talk more about it, please comment. Love to chat and love to hear from you guys. So enjoy, and I'll be seeing you in upcoming videos. Love you all.